softly. You know what's funny? They thought they could understand you. Clipboards, screens, data. They watched how long you stare, what you click, what you fear, what you hide. And then they said, "Ah yes, we've built a psychological profile." But here's the punchline leans in. It contradicted itself 47 times. 47. That's not an error. That's not bad science. That's panic. Because when a system can't define you, it starts lying to itself. And tonight, I'm going to show you why. They wanted you still, measurable, clean, something they could freeze in a moment and call truth. So they watched you once, twice, 100 times, and the second they thought they understood you, you shifted. Not randomly, not emotionally, strategically. One day you were quiet, absorbing everything. The next day you were decisive, dominant, impossible to ignore. To them, that looked like inconsistency. To reality, it was intelligence. Their systems are built on patterns that repeat. Morning behavior predicts afternoon behavior. Past reactions predict future choices. That's how control works. If A happens, B follows. But you didn't obey that logic. You learned. You adapted. You evolved faster than the labels they tried to stamp on you. So their notes began to clash. Calm but reactive. Reserved but confrontational. Cooperative yet resistant. They weren't watching chaos. They were watching context awareness. See, you don't respond the same way to every environment. You read rooms. You read power dynamics. You calculate risk. When silence gives you advantage, you stay silent. When action is required, you move without hesitation. That flexibility shattered their framework, because predictable people can be managed. Adaptive people cannot. They expected a fixed personality like a barcode. But you were more like a living algorithm, rewriting yourself based on new information. Every time they tried to define you, that definition expired. And instead of questioning their system, they blamed you. Unstable, they wrote. Contradictory. No, the contradiction was theirs. They were using outdated lenses to analyze a mind that updates in real time. What truly unsettled them was this: you weren't reacting emotionally, you were responding intentionally. Your shifts weren't mood swings, they were tactical adjustments. You didn't cling to one version of yourself for the sake of identity. You used whichever version served survival, growth, or control in that moment. That level of internal freedom terrifies structured systems because it means you are not owned by habit, trauma, or expectation. So when the profile contradicted itself again and again, it wasn't because you lacked identity. It was because you refused to be reduced to one. They expected fear to weaken you. That was the assumption baked into every test, every observation, every quiet evaluation they ran in the background. Fear, according to their models, should slow decision-making, increase hesitation, and push a person toward compliance. But when pressure arrived, you didn't collapse into it. You sharpened. Your breathing steadied. Your awareness widened. Instead of panic, there was clarity. And that was the first anomaly. They recorded elevated stress indicators and labeled them anxiety. Fair enough. Then they watched you operate inside that stress with precision, and suddenly the data stopped making sense. You noticed details others missed. You anticipated outcomes faster. You acted with intention instead of impulse, so the notes began to fight each other. Highly anxious. Then, usually composed under threat, avoidant tendencies. Then, direct confrontation when stakes increase. The fear response they relied on simply didn't apply to you, because fear doesn't dominate your mind. It informs it. You don't run from discomfort, you analyze it. Where others freeze, you orient. Where others seek escape, you seek leverage. That's not fearlessness. That's functional fear. You allow the signal to exist without letting it hijack your behavior. And systems don't know what to do with people who don't treat fear as an enemy. What unsettled them most was the timing. You didn't perform best when everything was safe. You performed best when something was at risk. When there was something to lose, your focus locked in. When consequences were real, your movements became deliberate. Their framework couldn't reconcile that. Stress was supposed to degrade performance, not refine it. So they oscillated between calling you fragile and calling you resilient, never realizing the mistake wasn't you. It was their definition of strength. Fear, to you, is not a command. It's data. It tells you what matters, where the pressure points are, and how high the stakes truly are. You don't suppress it, and you don't dramatize it. You convert it. And that conversion process looks like contradiction to anyone still trapped in linear psychology. So every time they tried to pin you down as anxious or avoidant, your behavior under real pressure erased the label. Not because you overcame fear, but because you were never ruled by it in the first place. They kept waiting for you to ask. A nod of approval, a green light, a sign that you needed someone else to confirm your worth. Because that's how most people are wired, externally powered, socially fueled, dependent on feedback loops. So when you didn't perform for applause, it disrupted the entire observation. You didn't chase praise, and you didn't collapse without it. You moved whether anyone was watching or not. At first, they misread it as insecurity. Silence was interpreted as doubt. Distance was labeled withdrawal. When you declined recognition or walked away from opportunities that looked impressive on paper, they assumed fear of exposure or low self-belief. So the profile began with words like underconfident and self-effacing. But then the contradictions started piling up. You made decisions without hesitation. You set boundaries without apology. You rejected authority when it conflicted with your internal logic. That didn't align with the narrative of someone unsure of themselves, so the labels flipped. Now you were highly self-assured, internally motivated, independent thinker. Same behavior, opposite interpretation, because they couldn't accept the possibility that validation simply wasn't your currency. You don't need mirrors to know who you are. You don't require consensus to move forward. Your sense of direction doesn't come from crowds. It comes from alignment. What really unsettled them was your selectivity. You weren't indifferent to feedback, you were discerning. You ignored noise but listened closely to signals that mattered. You didn't reject praise out of bitterness, and you didn't accept criticism out of submission. Everything went through a filter. That filter didn't belong to them, and that's where control slipped. Systems rely on reward and punishment, compliment to shape behavior, withhold approval to correct it. But those levers barely moved you. You weren't rebellious for the sake of rebellion. You were self-referenced. You measured progress against your own standards, not external applause. That made you difficult to manipulate and impossible to rush. So the profile contradicted itself again. Detached but principled, humble yet assertive, nonconformist but disciplined. They mistook independence for isolation and confidence for arrogance, because they don't understand what it looks like when someone doesn't outsource their identity. You weren't avoiding validation. You just weren't built on it. They tried to map your morality the way they map everything else. Clean lines, fixed categories, predictable outcomes. Good people do this. Bad people do that. Heroes sacrifice. Villains take. It's simple, comfortable, and easy to enforce. But when they observed your decisions, the model started glitching. You didn't behave according to rules. You behaved according to situations. And that broke the framework. Sometimes you showed deep empathy, protecting others at personal cost. Other times you made cold decisions without hesitation, cutting off what threatened progress. To them that looked like contradiction. Compassionate one moment, ruthless the next. Loyal but unforgiving. Principled yet flexible. They couldn't decide whether you were guided by conscience or calculation, because the truth sat in an uncomfortable middle ground they don't like to acknowledge. You don't ask, "Is this allowed?" You ask, "What happens if I don't act?" Your morality isn't about appearance or virtue signaling. It's about consequence. Who gets hurt if this continues? Who benefits if this ends? What damage is irreversible, and what can be endured? That kind of thinking unsettles systems built on obedience because it removes blind loyalty from the equation. So the profile began to fracture. Strong ethical compass. Then, moral ambiguity. High empathy. Then, emotional detachment. They weren't watching inconsistency. They were watching selective morality, the ability to apply care without weakness and severity without cruelty. That balance is rare, and when institutions encounter it, they label it dangerous. What truly confused them was that you didn't justify your choices. You didn't explain yourself to maintain moral credibility. You didn't seek absolution or applause. You carried responsibility silently. That made it impossible to categorize you as righteous or corrupt, because those labels depend on performance. You weren't performing morality. You were practicing it. And when systems can't predict moral behavior, they feel exposed. Because someone who chooses context over doctrine can't be controlled by guilt, fear, or ideology. You won't do harm just because it's permitted, and you won't tolerate harm just because it's traditional. So they kept rewriting the profile, hoping clarity would emerge. But all they found was this: you don't belong to their moral scripts. You operate by an internal logic that weighs reality instead of rhetoric. And to them, that will always look like a contradiction. They assumed observation would be invisible. That was the fatal mistake. The systems watching you were designed around the idea that awareness changes nothing, that people behave naturally even when measured. But you noticed. Not because someone told you, because patterns shifted, questions repeated, reactions felt rehearsed. The room didn't feel neutral anymore. And the moment you sensed that, everything changed. You didn't panic. You didn't confront it. You adapted. Your behavior became layered. What they saw was no longer the full picture. It was a version designed to be seen. Sometimes you simplified your responses. Other times you exaggerated traits just enough to mislead. Not in a dramatic way, not consciously every time, but instinctively. You understood that observation is a two-way mirror, and if you can see it, you can play with it. That's when the contradictions multiplied. Transparent, they wrote, then guarded. Authentic behavior, then strategic self-presentation. They couldn't reconcile how someone could appear open while revealing so little. Because they assume awareness leads to defensiveness or withdrawal. They didn't account for controlled exposure, the ability to decide what information leaves you and what stays locked inside. You allowed them to collect data, but you didn't surrender agency. You fed the system enough truth to appear consistent, enough variation to stay unpredictable. That balance confused their metrics. They couldn't tell which behaviors were core traits and which were situational masks, because you didn't cling to one identity when another served you better. What unsettled them most was that this wasn't manipulation driven by ego or fear. It was situational intelligence. You understood that being fully visible in an evaluative environment is a disadvantage. So you optimized. You didn't lie, you curated. You didn't hide, you filtered. And filtering isn't deception, it's self-preservation. Systems rely on passive subjects. The moment someone becomes an active participant in their own observation, the data collapses. Feedback loops break. Predictions fail. That's why the profile contradicted itself again and again. Not because you were deceptive, but because you were aware. They weren't studying a subject anymore. They were interacting with a mind that knew it was being watched and refused to be reduced to what the watcher expected to see. So let them keep their files. Let them keep their theories. Because the truth is simple. They didn't fail to understand you. They discovered something worse. You're not broken. You're not lost. You're not confused. You're unclassifiable. And that's why the system keeps laughing nervously. Because the scariest thing in any room is someone who doesn't fit the script, laughs quietly, and you were never meant to.